Hey everybody, Andrew Main here, and I am here live talking about creativity and writing. And it's been a long time since I've done one of these. I used to do Periscope sessions all the time back when that was on Twitter, which made it really easy to share this. Now I'm here doing a YouTube live stream. For those of you just tuning in or watching this later, thank you. For those of you trying to find me, I'm going to actually link this out because the first time I tried to do this, my camera was in my MacBook closed. So it was just blank. So what I'm going to do right now is give me one moment. I'm going to go ahead and share this link to anybody out there and put this up on Twitter. So I will be taking your questions so I can see the chat window over here to the right. And we can be talking about writing, creativity, productivity, publishing. We can talk about AI and writing too. That's a topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, whatever. And let me just add this here. And I apologize to everybody just tuning in. And there we go. So, one of the things I like to talk about is sort of the process of writing and something that sort of evolved for me in particular and kind of how it relates to other people. I got into writing later on in life. I mean, I've always written, but like many people, this is something that I didn't take seriously until later on when I decided I wanted to become an author. And that wasn't until my mid 30s. And at that point, I wasn't sure if I was even going to be capable of doing that because you have a lot of doubts. You wonder, you look around and you think like, well, other people just started off early. You have a lot of people who are prodigies at it, which I wasn't. I wasn't writing novels at 15 or whatever. I may have tried, but I just didn't have the patience to do that. So when I decided that I wanted to become a writer, I had to study the process of writing. And the first way you do this is you actually read. You read a lot. And so I started reading what other people had written, started to analyze some of my favorite books, not just from how I enjoyed it, but to think about what was going on there. What was really the kind of the mechanics of it, so to speak? What was the craft of it? And I started to notice patterns. I started to notice why I liked certain things. I noticed why certain kind of books appealed to me. And then I started to think about what kind of writer I want to be because there are many different kinds of writers, many different kinds of writing styles. And there's genres, people who write mystery, people who write horror, people who write nonfiction, et cetera. And you can move between them. You don't have to feel labeled any particular one. But when I talk about styles, I mean kind of the way people often approach books. When I first started writing, before I started writing novels, I'd be what was called a seat of the pantser, seat of pantser. And what that means is that sort of you just write in the seat of your pants, you just open it up and you just keep going and you see where it takes you. Over time, when I decided I wanted to become a novelist, I realized that wasn't going to work for me because it would take an inordinate amount of time to put enough words on the page that I could then go through and filter or even find the story from. And I wanted a more practical way to write. And so what I did was I started using outlines and I started outlining. At first, I thought an outline might destroy the fun for me, but I realized an outline is actually another part of the process I could really, really get into because it allowed me to figure things out, particularly when you're writing like mystery thrillers, etc. Then it helps because what you're doing is you're sort of understanding where you need to be at what point, but then you can have a lot of fun writing with it. Speaking of mystery thrillers, part of the reason I'm here today is because my new one, Night Owl, is available now. If you're an Amazon Prime reader for free. So if you haven't checked this out, check this out. Go to Amazon, look up Night Owl by Andrew Main, and mispronounced by name. There you go. Go look it up, and you can see if you're Amazon Prime, it's part of the first reads. What's cool is if you get this for free, you actually are able to buy the audiobook version for just like $1.99. So for $2, you get a Kindle book and an audiobook, which is kind of awesome, or just the Kindle for free. So check that out. This is a lot of fun. I'm going to talk a little about the book and sort of my process goes into it. And I'm a big believer in character. And this has got a great character. It's Brad Trasker. He's a former counterintelligence operative who's now gone into the world of Silicon Valley. And if he thought things were screwed up in the world of normal espionage, it gets even worse and the stakes are even more complicated. So I've had a lot of fun with that character, and I'm actually in the middle of writing the next one right now. So when we talk about outlining, we talk about this. For me, an outline is just a great way. It's a roadmap. It's sort of tell me like, what's going to happen? Where do I need to be at what point in the story? What do I need to do as far as getting the character through their journey? Now, one of the things that I've sort of thought about and sort of evolved into is I started with just sort of kind of like an outline for the story. Like I'd have a general sort of outline, like this is going to happen here, this happens here. But then the problem with that is I can still make it sort of formulaic. You don't want to put your story on rails where it's just like, you know, then this happens and this happens. It's not that's not entertaining. You want a story where you're curious about what happens next and your characters are actively trying to solve problems. When I watch a lot of episodic TV today, one of the biggest problems I see is that I see characters that sort of just move from point to point to point just when the writer's ready to do that, particularly on certain streaming services. And it can be frustrating because you want to be engaged by something, but when you're just watching it sort of, you know, go on like an amusement park ride where you know each point, it's not as entertaining as if you're with the character trying to figure stuff out. So, how do you do this? So, one of the things I do is I think about the story and I think about timelines. And there are several different kinds of timelines when it comes to story. I think about first, there's the world timeline. Now, I used to just think about it from the story timeline, and then this happens, this happens, this happens. But now I realize there's a couple other timelines that come first. So, one of those is basically think about the idea of the world timeline. The world timeline is basically this is all the events that happened. So, if I was going to do a story that was set in World War II, maybe I start that world timeline in 1941 or maybe 1939, whichever you want to do, the invasion of Poland or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Then I can look through the major events and say these are the major events of this. Then I can end it in, let's say, 1945. That is the world timeline. Those are the major events that happen. Now, if I'm going to write a book set in that world, I don't have to tell all those points, but that gives me an idea of what's going on in the world. Now, if you're writing, let's say I'm writing a spy thriller and I have a character who is investigating something. Well, first there's going to be the crime. There's going to be the reason the crime happened. Then there's going to be the character getting involved, the investigation of it. Then there's going to be other major events that the antagonists are involved with, whatever. Those things can happen off page, but I still have to know what happens. So that's part of the world timeline to sort of establish this is what's going on in the world. This means that meanwhile, while maybe our attention is on our character, something else is happening somewhere else. And so that's what's really critical about world timelines is they give you an idea to know what else is going on, because bad writing, you realize that nothing's happening between the scenes, or bad storytelling, bad TV shows between each scene, nothing is happening. You realize you're just waiting for the next thing. And then so-and-so pops up. Good ones, you feel like, oh shoot, somebody's plotting something. Somebody's trying to do something. I watched a recent TV show on a streaming service that was part of a big science fiction franchise, we'll say it that. And there are moments when like just really, really, really slow moments where you're like, the characters aren't even acknowledged that there's some impending ticking clock, and the writer's not acknowledging that. We're just having this long stretched out period that does nothing to really acknowledge that the rest of the world exists. It's literally, I just want to have a scene for somebody here. I'm going to have a scene for somebody here, and maybe write an invention for that to happen. And that's not fun. That's not engaging writing. So starting the world timeline gives you an idea of what is going on. This is the scenario. This is where it begins. This is where it ends. And you can even get really creative and think about if nothing happens, it goes this way. If something happens, that goes that way. But keeping to the simple idea of a world timeline is basically the events that take place. So the second thing you can think about then is you can then have your character timeline. The character timeline is what your characters go through. Now, if you take, let's say this, the Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones books. You can have your characters, meanwhile, so-and-so's here, so-and-so's here, so-and-so's there, and this is what they're doing. And a character timeline, it gives you an idea of what's going on. And obviously you want to have them for your protagonist, but think about that for your antagonist too. Think about that for the other aspects in your story, the other characters in your story. If you're only concerned about what your main character's doing, then that's how you create two-dimensional character, because your other characters just pop up out of nowhere. But if your antagonists are planning and doing their own things, then that makes the story richer and more interesting. So character timeline is basically what is the events the character does. Now the story timeline. The story timeline, think of it more as where you choose to pay attention to things. So if I have a character and I write first person POV, so you're with my character in my character's head, I can't have you with them 24/7 because they're going to spend, 8 hours, or if it's one of my characters, probably 5 hours a night sleeping. And a lot of other times, using the restroom, eating, doing mundane things that don't need to be in the novel. So my story timeline is basically what events do I need to tell about what's going on in their lives? That character has a timeline, even though we haven't seen them in 12 hours. They've done things, they've breathed, they've eaten, they've bathed, they've done these other stuff. I don't have to acknowledge all of that if it's not relevant, but I have to be aware that these things happened. And that can trip up writers because sometimes it's like they just drop a character into a scene with the idea that they didn't exist before or nothing happened before. And so what you want to do is basically think about that world you're building, think about the idea of what's going on both on the large scale events, what's going on in the characters' lives, and then figure out where you want your story to focus as you move around. But starting from a world and starting from the character helps it make it easier to figure out your story. And what do you do for your story timeline? That's easy. You just show the interesting parts. You just do what's interesting. You just go there. So that's that. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. You can pop them up into the chat here or ask me on Twitter. I'll be checking both of those. And one of the things I want to talk about is using ChatGPT as a writing tool. And what I mean by writing tool, I don't mean to actually write. For those who don't know, I've been involved in AI for several years now. I worked for OpenAI and I left about a month ago to work on a startup that's a consulting group. But I've had a lot of interest in how these things work. I've been following through on this stuff and trying to figure out like what are these tools useful for? What do I want to use them for? What not? In particular, the Chat GPT, the thing that I've seen is I've watched the evolution. I had access to GPT-3 when it first came out. Then I went to work at OpenAI. I got to work at GPT-4 before that was released. And I'm in the paper for GPT-4 for working at some of the capabilities for it, et cetera. And it's been interesting to sort of see these things become more capable in writing better, but they're still not at the level, I would say, for fiction content or really good nonfiction content because they understand how to write short passages. Really long passages are still a limitation there. And a really good long passage sets something up here that gets picked up later on and resolved at the end. AI will eventually get there. I have no doubts about that. I've seen enough progress and understand the path forward to believe that AI will become as good or better of a writer than I am. But for now, it's still a lot of work to get really convincing good writing out of it. But that doesn't mean it's not a good writing tool. It's really good at editing. It's really good at brainstorming. It's really good for helping you outline, and it's really good for research. If you're using ChatGPT and you're using it with the search enabled, which allows you to search the web, it's extremely powerful. For a book that I wrote after Night Owl, Dark Dive, which is my next Sloan McPherson book. In that book, I have a lot of technical details about cave diving. Now, I'm an open water diver. I've done shark dives, did a TV special for Discovery Channel, diving with great white sharks. But cave diving is something I've never done. And as much as I've talked to other cave divers or talked to cave divers, and I've read about it and watched documentaries and stuff on it, there's a lot of technical details about it that might escape me. So what I do is I use ChatGPT to help me understand some of these things. I ask it questions like, "Hey, what are some locations where people might cave dive in northern Florida? What are their depths? What's the history? Whatever." And then I ask it to provide the citation. So I don't just ask it to tell me. I say, "Can you look this up?" And then it'll come back with a link for me, and then I can follow the link and then read the original source. If it's something I really recommend. There's a lot of talk about how AI can hallucinate. Technically, everything's a hallucination. Technically, everything is, something we think is true, but maybe not true. The difference is when they turn out to be true or not. With AI, I find that when I'm doing research, I like to use systems like ChatGPT with browsing, where it can provide the links for me, so then I can just click on them and verify it. Over time, these things are going to become more reliable, but right now, it's a really good way to make sure that you're not putting things into there you shouldn't. Um, Tammy asks, based purely on current state, any fiction targeted AI tools you prefer writing process or assist? So, in answer to that, Tammy, like I don't want a tool to write for me. I don't want an AI tool to write for me. And I've not seen any good ones. Like I've seen ones that can start off with prompts and stuff like this, but if you understand how these systems are trained, you start to see these patterns sort of come up. And that will change over time. But right now, the existing tools, I think they might be neat for like starting a thing, or if you want to continue a little bit of dialogue or whatever. But I've never seen something that beyond just doing regular kind of copywriting or regular kind of stuff and routine writing, which I think those things excel at that. I haven't really seen anything there that's been useful. And I've been playing with these things for years. Sometimes people like, this feels great, but like partially too, it's like I love to write. To me, it's kind of like I don't need a if I played the guitar, I don't need a tool to play the guitar for me. You know, I would want to play it, but sadly I can't. So in the case of these tools, some of them may make part of the process easier, and I'm not aware of one that's been particularly useful. I think that any search tool or any AI enabled search tool, whether it's ChatGPT, it's Bing that's enabled by this or Claude or whatever that anything that has search enabled in it, I would recommend it. The problem I would say though is that like I'm obviously very biased towards ChatGPT, and I used a tool. It wasn't particularly a writing tool, but a tool that was a research tool by a big startup, and I asked it to like give me some details. Like I have tests that I do to figure out how well an AI is working and what it's doing. And I'd asked this one, and they used GPT-4 on the back end, but they weren't using the search, or they were whatever they were doing, but they weren't using it in a reliable way. I'm like, can you tell me the latest episode of like Star Trek Lower Decks? ChatGPT got it, looked online, got it, gave me the outline of the story perfectly because it went and said, "Oh, well, I should search the web for this." And so it searched, got that information, and then summarized it for me. This other tool, I asked it that, and I could tell right away that it was a made up episode because it was one of these like in a space, the space odyssey, whatever. It was a title that just felt so GPT 3.0 kind of thing. And then it gave me this description. I'm like, this is completely fake. And even though this tool is supposed to be enabled to do web search, it didn't do a web search, and it didn't tell me it didn't do it. And I think that's one of the things that I think people have to look out for when it comes to these systems is that something might be enabled to do that, but you want to know. How do you know if a tool's actually doing web searches and stuff? Well, generally, like ChatGPT, they provide links to the citations, and you can click on those to go see it. If it just tells you something, then you're probably counting on it using its memory. And that's where it's important to know the cutoff dates and other important things about that. So I love using these as research tools. You can use them a lot of different ways, like just doing basic research, asking things. If you want to know something about a region or an area, you can say, hey, I've used it for, you know, describing like, hey, I have a book coming out that starts off set like 10,000 years ago. And I'm like, hey, what was Florida like 10,000 years ago? Can you give me a description of the fauna and flora and whatever's there? And then provide citations. And so then I would get a list of these things and say, okay, that's kind of interesting. And I can start looking up things linguistically, et cetera. So it's super helpful. And it's one of many tools that you can use. One of the things I use, it's not an AI tool, which is great for writing, is I use Google Maps all the time. So if I've got to tell a story and set it in a particular location, another part of the world, or even a place that maybe I think I'm familiar with, I'll go use Google Maps and drop the little yellow dude there and take a look around and see what's like it. That's helpful for a lot of things. Like it can be very useful because, let's say you have two characters and they're sitting in a cafe talking, which is kind of just a very generic sort of setup. But if I say, yeah, they're in a sitting in a cafe, they're in Chicago, it's summer. Let me find Chicago cafes and go look at it. And I find like, oh, cool. Here's one by an art museum. Oh, well, that's interesting. Now I've got a sidewalk cafe. It's across the street from an art museum, which tells me a bit more because now I know the patrons coming in and out of the museum. Now I know who might be sitting around them. And maybe if my character is a person who is from, a sophisticated world, maybe they'll run into somebody they see. Maybe it could have an effect on it. And that may never have come to me if I just sit there like, oh, sit in a cafe talking. But if I go find a actual physical cafe, I can look around and say, what things might affect the story based upon what's going on here. So again, that's not an AI tool, but it's another way to use an assist from technology. Back to ChatGPT, one of the things you can have it do that's helpful is you can certainly do edits. You can certainly say, can you go through my text and check it? I built a script with GPT-4 to go through my rough drafts to fix kind of mistakes and stuff and whatnot. Basically it was just take each section, go through there, do this. I explained what the characters' names are. And so that was a useful tool. But another thing that's really great now is in ChatGPT, there's the ability to do document retrieval, which is rolling out in beta, which basically means you upload some documents to it. And then you say, can you find this? Can you find this? Can you find some reference to this? And I've been doing that basically by writing my own script to do that, where what I would do is basically have a folder full of stuff and then tell ChatGPT to search through it. I would use a thing called embedding search, which basically is a way to create a fuzzy search index where you grab sections of, let's say, a paragraph at each time, and you create what's called an embedding. Short version of embedding. An embedding is a way to describe text, or it can actually be images or any sort of information, in a way that allows you to relate it to other information like a query or whatever. And so what that means is if I wanted to create, if I said, gave it the word watch, and I gave it the word can, and then I gave it the word, car, it might say, give them, like, they uses vectors, which is basically say like XYZ axis. It might say, okay, it's kind of close to car. They're kind of close to here. But I would say, okay, what about in the category of things that move? Like, well, car and watch might be a little bit further out because a watch, maybe it's mechanical watch, has movement. If I said, what about things that hold things? Well, car holds people and a can holds people. So in that dimension, it's going to have some sort of value. So the way to think about it is a way to sort of have fuzzy sort of relationships between stuff. So I can take a book and turn it into vector embeddings and then say, find me a scene that's funny. And it won't just look for, it'll look for scenes where so and so smiled and, so and so made a comment or a joke or whatever. It won't look for the words just necessarily funny, but it might find places where there was something humorous that took place. Okay. So that's what's cool about that. That's a little bit of a technical deep dive, but I can take my previous books and then make them searchable that way, which is great because instead of just trying to find keywords, I can find like relationships between people. I can find other connections and stuff. And this has been super helpful because I have my Jessica Blackwood series, I have my Theo Craig series, I have my Sloan McPherson series. Now I have my Brad Trasker series. So I've got 4 different series that I still write for or use the characters from. And that's 20 plus books, which means there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of things I have to look up, which can be very tricky. So the ability to do really good embedding sort of search makes my life a lot easier. So that's one of the ways where ChatGPT is super helpful because basically I can use it to search the world. It's like my research assistant. I can also use it to search my own text to say, can you find something for me that helps me understand what's going on here? So anyhow, I would love to hear your questions. Please feel free to ask them. It's been a while since I've done one of these. I feel like I'm getting a little more warmed up here. I live for this because in talking to you, it helps me think about things. I got into writing later in life, and one of the things I think that helped me was sort of the understanding that I was going to have to learn this process. And my first year of writing, I made a decision that I was going to write a lot and I was going to read a lot about writing. So I'd write a book, then read a book on writing, then write a book and read a book on writing, and then kind of go do a post-mortem to say, like, what did I learn? What came of this? What do I need to figure out from here? And let me just check here. And just making sure I don't have any other pending emails from anybody here. So questions are fine. I'm happy to talk about, other aspects of that too. Okay. Uh, Tammy says, I heard you on a great interview fairly early in your writing career. The most memorable part of the interview was your self-confidence. Do you ever struggle with self-doubt about your writing? All the time. All the time. I'm confident in that, like, I am a thinking human that can solve problems as we all are. But self-doubt, like, yeah, like sometimes I finish a book and I feel good. Sometimes I finish a book, I go, man, I think I may have missed this. Um, I sometimes think like I should have paid more attention. I should have put more effort into it. I have self-doubt all the time. I am riddled with self-doubt. And however confident I may sound or however like authoritative I may present myself to be, I don't know. I'm still figuring this stuff out. And I'm saying things here going like, hey, there's this, not because, oh, I've spent for the last 20 years, this is the way I've done it. Like, no, like this is the thing I've been doing and it works, or I think that it works. So everybody goes through that. Now, I'll share a story, which was, when I worked at OpenAI, I'm working with like the most talented research scientists in the world, not just in AI, but just brilliant scientists and people who are just incredibly clever. And I'm like a fly on the wall watching all of this. And I remember we had a researcher who worked on a really amazing project. It was very much has changed the way we do a lot of things now. and super, super neat person, super sweet, super smart. And we had a party to celebrate the launch of this. And he got up and said that uh, he felt like he had imposter syndrome. Now, here I am. I don't come from a formal AI background. I don't come from a background in, not even a technology background. Working at OpenAI was my first like technology job and kind of like my first real job that I had like ever. And to be there, hearing this guy who is absolutely brilliant talk about having imposter syndrome, I'm like, what do I have then? Because I must have imposter syndrome because I can't even, compare myself to somebody like that who spent his life becoming such an expert in something. So, and I would say it's a common thing. When I was around a lot of other people, they're really, really talented people. They all suffered this because they're looking around these other people going, how do I do this? But part of the problem is that we often compare ourselves to everybody. Well, if you compare yourself to everybody, you will win. Never. If you compare yourself to everybody, you're always going to lose because somebody somewhere is going to have outdone something you've done. That's why what you want to think of yourself as you're a combination of many things. Okay. You're a combination. So I think that I like to write straightforward prose. I haven't really, I've tried more literary styles. It's not for me. I like to be more direct in what I do. Maybe I could become a much more literary writer and have this ability to write paragraphs or sentences that maybe they'll go, oh, that was masterfully crafted. But I like to focus on kind of the story in my storytelling, and I like to think more about like, oh, what's a very interesting conflict or what's some aspect of science that plays a factor in here? What's something I could use in here and communicate in my stories and do that? So I have things that I feel are important to me, and that means I have to make choices. Do I want to be good at this or I want to be good at that? Ideally, be great at everything, but I don't know how you choose that option. So when it comes to imposter syndrome, or self confidence, is that everybody I know who's not psychotic has it. Everybody I know is has it. They have this sort of thing. They feel like they could be doing better. And the difference is that you don't want to get into like self-loathing. You can think like, yeah, I don't know, like maybe I need to be better, whatever. But don't get to the point of hating yourself. Don't get to the point of being unrealistic about it. If people, when I got my first reviews for my books and people seemed to like my books, then I started to feel okay. I'm not the worst writer in the world, and there are people that like my writing, so there's some value there, and there's some reason for me to write besides writing for myself. So that's I think about what to do is just understand you're writing for yourself first, and then if you want to share it, if other people might like it, then great, then feel good about that. You don't have to be, the 100% best for everything, and I'll tell you that's the thing too is that like here's a funny thing about reviews, which will relate to that. Some of my favorite books that I've read by other authors don't have 5 stars. Some of them have 4, some have 3.5 because I realize something that really hits for somebody else may not hit for another person. And that's why it's really important to understand your goal is not to reach everybody. Your goal is to reach certain people, the people you want to reach. And if you're reaching them and they like what you're doing, then you should feel good. And that just doesn't apply to writing, it applies to a lot of things. Now, ideally, you want, if you're making a very generalized thing like an application or a phone or something that everybody's supposed to use, it's different. But in a very selective, subjective world of art, trying to please everybody may not make you happy in the end. And there are cases where sometimes there are things that just everybody kind of digs and likes, a Paddington movie or something. But we're not all trying to do that. So, anyhow, self doubt every day, every night, go to sleep, self doubt. It's there, it's always there. And uh, Timothy writes, what are the most central things you evaluate during the postmortem? Do you usually target the same sort of stuff or does it vary? That's a great question, Timothy. So, one of the things I've done is when I start to write a book, I put together a mission statement to say, this book is this. This is what I want to accomplish. And I think very much about that and say, and I'll use an example mentioned later on as a naturalist. I said, okay, I've got to introduce a scientist character, and I want a couple things to happen. Is I want you at the end of the book to take somebody who could be extremely unrelatable on the outside. This is a computational biologist who thinks extremely analytically, and you might even think is psychotic or whatever. And I want you to get inside his head and realize he's extremely compassionate and to understand how he sees the world in a way that kind of can make you go, oh, I can relate to this actually. He's curious like a child, like me. So that's one of the things I wanted to do. The other thing is I said, I want to take a character that's passive, that sees himself outside. He's an observer, or he's a scientist, he's a biologist watching the world. And I'm going to make him realize, no, he is part of it and he has tools that he has to use to become more engaged. And by the end of the book, I want him to be fully engaged in this world. And the rest of the books take to like, how far does that go? Where does it? So I had a mission statement of what I wanted to do. And I had some other points I wanted to like, okay, I want to have kind of like a really crazy badass sort of scene at the end. I wanted to have a antagonist that was like uh almost supernatural in how scary they were. And so I set these things out. And then when I set out to write it, that's what I did. Sloan McPherson, the first book, was the same thing. As I had a mission statement, I said, okay, I need to take her from the outside, put her on the inside. I need to make her relatable, but I need to show why people have difficulty dealing with her because of her impulsiveness, etc. So I would say that when I have a clear mission statement for a book and I get to the end of the book or writing the book, if I can look back at my mission statement and said, yes, I hit the things I hit, I generally feel very good about it. But sometimes in postmortems, I'll go like, you know what? I spent way too much time in this section here. I should have spent more time here. I should have stepped back and looked at the story as a whole, and I should have done that. And that still gets to me. I still think about that all the time about what this is. And you have to, sometimes your instincts, I think if you're not deluding yourself and you trust your instincts and your instincts are based upon experience, not just, magic, they can be very good. And what I mean by that is, I know two young filmmakers who set out to make movies around the same time. And one of them gone through film school, had made a ton of short films, and then had an idea what he wanted to do for a feature film, and basically felt confident about it and had a reason to think so because he had a lot of practical experience managing all sorts of production. I had another friend who had been on set for bunches of films and was extremely technically knowledgeable, and who set out to make a film too, who was extremely confident about the success of his film, but had never done like shorts, had never done the sides of managing the budget and et cetera and all this. And those two films had completely different trajectories. Both had a certain kind of confidence and a little bit of self doubt. One had confidence based upon experience, one had confidence based upon assumed experience. And what's the difference is I write about police officers, I write about law enforcement. My brother and my dad were in law enforcement. I can write about that, but I don't have that experience. I can't assume that I would be a good cop because I read about or wrote a lot about police officers. That would be assumed experience. Had I been a police officer or had I been in law enforcement, had I been a detective in, let's say, a local police department, I wanted to write about an investigator for the FBI, I might be able to say, okay, I can exchange or extrapolate that. I'm a diver, so I'm not an expert on, like I said, I don't do cave diving, but I do open water diving. So I can take some of my experience and apply it. So I have some confidence in my ability to write about diving. But the point is you want to think about what you feel confident doing, etc. So anyhow, back to the point of like the post-mortem, that comes down to basically, if you feel like you set out to do what you did, you had a pretty good idea what you do, and you feel like you hit it, and you hit it. And I found that that's generally been the case. If I hit my mission statement, if I hit that, if I get the points of my mission statement, I generally feel pretty good. If I felt like my mission statement was clear and I get to the end of the book, I'm not so sure. So postmortems have been effective, and I think they're hard. They're really, really hard to want to do. Like, you have to sit down to say, okay, let me take apart the thing that I wrote and analyze it, and just it can be excruciating, but it's also part of the process to get better at it. So anyhow, I'm Adrian Main talking here about writing. This is my latest novel, Night Owl. So here's the deal. Amazon Prime. If you're an Amazon Prime subscriber, you can go get this book now, the Kindle version, for free. And the cool thing too is if you have the Kindle version, you can get the audiobook version for just like $1.99. So that's $2. You get a ebook and a audiobook. I really like this story. I'm a big fan of Brad. I've wanted to do more thrillers, more techno thrillers, spy stuff. I want to do this. I wanted to find a way into it. And so this was sort of my approach towards doing it. And I think, I hope you enjoy it. So please check it out. And if you like it, if you read a few chapters of it, if you really enjoy it, let me know. If you want to share it with people on Amazon, if you enjoy it, please tell other people. That would be great. Ingrid says, I still use your Naturalist novel as a template for how to do cliffhangers. Excellent novel. Thank you, Ingrid. And, I copied James Patterson. I looked at Patterson's stories and the cliffhanger element. So, that's where I learned that from. Was I looked at really good, that kind of novel. I said, oh, I need to end you going end the chapter going, what's next? What's next? I need you to keep coming into it. So that's a really, I think it's a great strategy for that sort of style. And so, yeah, it's not original to me. Like I copied first person POV from Suzanne Collins in the Hunger Games. I just loved that style of doing that. The shorter, brisk cliffhanger chapters was the thing by looking at James Patterson and some other thriller writers. I said, oh, that's what I'm going to do there. So that's what you do is you look around at different styles and you find things that fit you and then you apply it. And here's the funny thing is that when I did, actually before The Naturalist, when I did Angel Killer, my Jessica Blackwood series, which was the first time I wrote a book with a first person present tense POV, because, read it in Hunger Games, Susan Collins, which I really enjoyed. I didn't really have a lot of background. I hadn't read a lot of mystery thrillers. I had not read a lot. I read a couple just to get an idea, but I didn't really have a deep knowledge of the genre. And I'd never read one that was first person point of view. I'd never read one in that. And I'm sure there were, but I didn't. And what happened was because but it wasn't a genre, it wasn't a style on that point that was really used in that genre very much, if ever. And so it forced you to sort of think about things differently because if you're doing a mystery and I can't go away from the character or I can't even go outside the character's head, I have to put things in front of you all the time. I have to keep doing that. And I have to put them in front of the character. And sometimes the character doesn't know them, but the audience does, etc., which is a different style of doing it. I think that's why I got nominated for the Thriller Award twice in the Edgar with that series. I think that's why that happened was because for people who read those categories, my using another style that I liked from another genre in there felt fresh. And it was just me trying to find a style that I like to write to. And I ended up getting, you know, some wonderful critical praise for that. And that sometimes can kind of be cool because you're just trying to figure out what fits you by looking around like, I like that. I like that. I'm gonna put these things together. And oh, that's nobody's explored that. I mean, not nobody. Do not want to say like I was a first, anything like that, but it was not done a lot. So that's kind of one of the cool things about picking up things you like from styles. So Naturalist, uh funny thing about the Naturalist. So the Naturalist was I had sold I'd been pretty successful as an indie author. I'd had, one of my books, several of my books actually together made me one of the top 10 selling indie authors on Amazon back in 2010 or 2011, something like that. I'd been reached, some really amazing sales from that. And that got me book deals and stuff. But then being a really popular indie Kindle seller isn't the same as being a successful traditional publishing writer. For some people it is, but for me, it just wasn't. And I had written Naturalist for another publisher. And because they said, I talked to them about this idea, they really liked the idea. They said, okay, cool. We'd love to see that. And so I presented them the manuscript, pretty much what you saw with the final form of it. And they're like, nah, it's not for us. We're going to pass, which hurt, heartbreaking. It was one of those things where they said they wanted it and then I gave it to them and they didn't want it. And finally, my agent believed in it and she shopped it around and then she found my current publisher, Thomas and Mercer, which was owned by Amazon, and they loved it. They loved it. And that's one of the things it's crazy because you can see one publisher who had liked other stuff I did said, not for us. Then another publisher picks it up. So Thomas and Mercer picked up the book. And then it was the number one selling book on all of Amazon for 7 weeks. It outsold Harry Potter. And that's what's crazy about this business. Had the final word been the other publisher said, no, it's not it, I'd be thinking like, oh, I failed. This book just really isn't. And even in the edit of that book, I had not the current developmental, not the editor that I use now, but an editor there who wasn't the right fit. Some people, it just finding the right editors and finding the right development editors, it can really depend. It just personality. That one, very accomplished, very talented, but it was just not the right fit for me. And they're like, I don't know about this whole first act. I think this is problematic. And it was just this kind of like, I don't. And I'm like, the one thing I think I know is plot. I'm like, I think I know plot, and I'm going to ignore all of your instructions. And I'm just going to do what I feel is right. I will clarify things. So I need to explain things. But this person, if they'd had their way, I would have completely changed it. Maybe they would have been right. Maybe it would have spent 8 weeks with number one. I don't know. But I had to go with what I felt was right there. And I think too was that my style of writing, whatever, is different for that person. And I think also, I think that I don't think they knew that I'd written like 3 books before and that I'd been like a thriller finalist and Edgar and et cetera. Not that that matters, but I think that they thought this was like my first book and that I was making these decisions without having an idea behind them. And so anyhow, that was the thing about The Naturalist is that first publisher said no, and then, the first editor to look at it, not the acquisition editor, but the freelancer they hired to do developmental edits was like really like, I don't think it's gonna work. And it's like, sometimes they're right. Like my first novels that I had, my Jessica Blackwood books, my editor that worked with the publisher, Hannah Woods, she was amazing. She was a super talented editor, and I learned so much from her in her notes and her edits and whatnot, and helped me become a much stronger writer. And that was not like I walked in there going, "Oh, I know what I'm doing." Like I had strong ideas about certain things, but I knew there was a lot of things I didn't know. And so you can learn a lot from these situations, and sometimes you can learn to just ignore. But you don't do it out of ego. Don't do it out of ego. You have to step back and say, "Okay, you have to entertain, you have to spend a few minutes to say, what if they are right? What does this mean?" And then step back and say, okay, I think I'm going to go with mine. Again, that other editor, maybe they're no, I mean, maybe Naturalist would have been like, one in its 10th season on some streaming network right now because it was going to be even that much, but maybe like that's possible. Although it did go through, get optioned and stuff and had, close to having TV projects made around it. But the point is, I don't know. I'm not saying they're wrong, but I knew what was right for me. And that's a point to know. In the subjective world of writing, you have to have an understanding of it. Like, just because something has to be a right fit, and it's hard to always know. Nobody knows anything. The story about Harry Potter getting turned down 42 times. I mentioned to somebody the other day, said, well, what if each time they got edits? I'm like, maybe it got better each time, but if you've been in this process long enough, 42 times you get notes from people, it's not going to be good. I think J.K. Rowling probably started off with something pretty damn good, but it was so hard for editors and stuff to wrap their heads around it. Think about that. 42 times, the most successful children's literary franchise of all time, turned down 42 times. 42 times people picked it up and went, I just don't see it. I don't see it. And finally somebody did. And so that doesn't mean that anything I do that people don't like is really good and they just don't know any better. No, it just means that nobody knows anything, including yourself. And that's why to me, it's very important to have objective things by which I look at how to evaluate it. I have objective measures to go like, okay, did anybody like it? Was I getting faint praise? And you have to learn, like, it's so hard because, like, when you reach a certain level, like, people will, one, give you praise, but you have to really parse it to figure out, like, is that really legitimate? If you pitch somebody an idea and they go, oh, that's great. I'm like, that's not a good response. Of like, can I read it? Can I be the first one to read it? And like, oh, that's a really good response. So, question here is, let's go through here. Um, Augusto writes, hi, talking about that. How do you know when a story is really ready and you get to feel you reached the best point? I don't know. It's like anything. The expression is that we don't so much finish things as we abandon them. And in that, as artists, we have to sort of say, is it good enough? Is it good enough? And so, when I have a story, I have a pretty good idea in the outline phase if it's ready. And I think that's really critical. Say in the outline, what have I accomplished? What was the premise I set up at the beginning? There was just a situation. Did I resolve it at the end? Did I resolve it in a satisfying way where the character had to work for it and it was also interesting to see them work? If I feel I have that, then I feel good. And for the writing, I'm atypical in that my edits I end up adding, and so like I'll write a book and it might be 72,000 words, and the final one will be like 80,000 because I try to sort of go through moments and try to kind of like get you from scene to scene and get that story across, and then I might go back in there and paint you a picture and tell you a bit more about the restaurant they're in or the environment or whatever. I might try to paint a better picture. So um, for me, that means that like if I'm able to tell the story in that shorter amount of time, like okay, I feel I've got the story there. I don't have to keep inventing and keeping going on and on and on. So as far as knowing you're done, you never are. You can always make it better. The challenge is knowing when to stop. And that's the better answer is how do you know when to stop? You look at your mission statement. You said, did I accomplish this? If you did, then go on. That's my attitude. Um, Timothy wants to know what is your current opinion on writing fast? Um, Writing fast, I'll describe it like this. This is an analogy. It's been in my head a lot. I don't know if I've ever really articulated it, but it comes down to like this: is when I write, what I want to do is make sure that I. It's like driving at night. And my dad explained to me when I was younger, you have your headlights. Don't drive faster than your headlights. And what does that mean? Basically, don't drive so fast that you can't react if something's in the middle of the road. And you don't want to write too fast that you basically put yourself into. If you write too fast without thinking, you sometimes might find yourself in corners a lot more often than you want. Corners can be great. Putting yourself into a corner can be great because then you step back and think about it, and then you have to come up with a solution and get yourself out of it. But if you're finding yourself always in corners and then basically taking detours, then it's not as good. So writing fast, I write probably pretty fast, but I outline though. So, where does the writing process begin for me? I have books that, I've written books in a week, but I didn't first start thinking about them that day. Well, that's not true. I did write a book called How to Write a Novella in 24 Hours where I show you how to do that. But for like my commercial stuff, I spend time thinking about it. So the process of writing itself may not take a long time, but um, I'm working on the sequel to Night Owl, Death Stake, and I would say for the last several months, every morning I wake up and I think about it. Just think about it. And so it's a question of like, where does the writing process begin? And for me, I think about this stuff a lot. If I said, okay, if I had to write a novel in like 3 days, I could do that. But one, it wouldn't be as fun and I wouldn't have as many opportunities to think about things creatively as if I had more time. There's too much time. And, too much time, you just doesn't improve things, but also too little time means, oh man, if I thought a little bit longer, I could have a better way for this to go, a better way for that. So I'd say the best way to write is just write at the level that you can be creative and clever. If you can't be clever, then slow down. If you can be clever, you can continue. And that comes, what I'll say, it comes with practice. And an example I bring up a lot when I do these live streams is in LA, I used to go see this show called Opening Night, which was done at called the Improv Olympic, which was in Hollywood. And every night, there's about 4 or 5 performers that go on stage and they would do a musical. Every Friday night, they would go do a musical. And it was an hour-long musical. They had songs, dancing, whatever, and ending. And it always killed, always killed. The funny thing is, it was completely improvised. They completely made it up. And what that meant was they would go on stage, they'd ask the audience for suggestions like, "Hey, give us something." People would say, "Oh, a horse race," and say, "Oh, a rich family," or this, and I'd say, "Okay." And then they would improvise it. And I will tell you, I've seen that show several times, and some nights that I watched a better musical than I've seen in professional musicals that were planned. Why are they so good at it? Because they understand pacing, because they understand character. The people doing this know how to hop into a show tune. They know how to make everything work. They know way more about musicals, the construction of a musical, than I do. As a consumer watching this, I'm like, I'm entertained. Like, man, they really nailed those notes. Man, that was really entertaining. Wow, that was really funny. Now, I don't know that, like, oh, yeah, when that guy set up his job occupation there, that guy over there was thinking about like a funny joke about this. I don't see that. I just see the thing in front of me. And I think writing is like that too, where you get comfortable enough, you can write pretty well and not worry about finding yourself stuck or whatever. So I think fast writing is perfectly fine. The advantage is um if I want to be cinematic, the faster I sort of write, the more in real time it takes place for me. And I have a very badass shootout sequence here that takes place here that I'm one of my best, I think. And it's very violent, very whatever. And I had to think about it methodically. I had to diagram stuff out there. I had to do this. But once I had the diagrams and things laid out, the faster I could kind of just flow through what's going on, the more kind of real timey it could feel for me. Versus, if I spent weeks writing it, which maybe been the better approach. I don't know. If we were shooting a shootout for a feature film, we would spend a month getting everything right. But for writing, just trying to see what's going on and putting myself in the mind of the reader, the faster I can kind of do this, the better. And then I can go back and pay attention to it. So that can happen. I think sometimes for dialogue too. Sometimes dialogue, if you're in the zone, and the zone means you're sort of aware and you're aware of the characters, you're aware of their needs, whatever. Sometimes these things can work because you can make it feel sort of snappy and whatever and sort of see it. So I'd say that's an advantage of being able to write faster. Now, if I actually measured the amount of time, that I was thinking or whatever, it would be like, it'd be like Inception, where I'd find out that like, oh man, this felt really fast writing. Like 1 minute for me was actually like 1 minute in my head was probably 5 hours of actually typing or something. So not quite, but anyhow, you get my point. Disadvantages is like I said, you just lose your opportunity for being clever. The advantage is it forces you to keep moving forward. And I think that one of the biggest problems writers have is they're trying to figure things out on the spot when they should have figured out certain things previously. Like I write my stories in a way that like I know what's going to happen in a scene. I know the outcome. I don't know how we get there necessarily. I don't know what choices the character is going to make that's going to get us there. And that's what makes it interesting to me. I know what the consequences will be, but how does the character get themselves into that? And that's what keeps it fresh for me when I write is I can say, okay, I know this is going to happen, but I don't have in my outline that says because he said this stupid word or he did this or whatever. So just a way to think about that. I'm going to hang around here for about 10 more minutes. So if you have any more questions, let me know and we'll keep talking about them. Tammy writes, this is all great info. Thanks. Excited about Night Owl and new protagonist. It's been a minute since writing a novella. Any current opinions on critique groups, accountability groups, ever utilize them? I've never used them. And I think that they have value. I would say, like, I learned a lot about writing when I took a night school program on creative writing. Basically, because I wanted to be around a teacher or somebody who knew anything. Because I knew writers, but nobody who was really paid to pay attention to what I was doing. And so going to that class was great. And I had a teacher who loved writing, who pointed out what were weaknesses. She read my writing and had praise, but it could point out weaknesses, and that was useful for me because then the praise was my role building was good, but my characters weren't as well defined. And so I said, let me take that weakness and make it into a strength. And so now I just write character stuff. My books start with interesting people who I'm inside their heads, so I have a really good idea. And that came from getting a criticism there. The challenge of writing groups and other stuff like that, the problem is that when you're talking to other frustrated writers, and writers are really neurotic, their neuroses may bleed over into other criticisms and whatnot. And I see very talented people get into this place of having a lot of self-doubt because you don't know if the note somebody gave you today came from a good place or because somebody else was angry and wanted to take it out on you. And I've seen that happen with other people and stuff where they'll look at stuff or there'll be, a bullying effect or whatever, or this, there can be good things and bad things and all sorts of things, outcomes from that. I think that if you do it in a small dose to sort of say, let me get kind of a temperature for this thing, more to find out what are my weaknesses, not to find out if this is great or not, because writers really suck at that. At me, I'm bad. Like people go, okay, to review my book. I'm like, I'm not going to be good at it because I'm going to focus on the things I focus on and over focus on them. And I might miss the whole forest for the trees. And so I'm hesitant. Like I just don't like to, I'll give basic notes about somebody like, okay, technically the pacing's here. Technically this is here, but I can't tell you, oh, this is great or whatever. Cause I don't know. I don't mean that like, oh, I'm trying to be humble. Like I really don't know because I know people who write in genres that aren't for me. And I might go, oh, this is really simplistic in this and stuff. And then it's like, well, that's a thing. And I remember I had a conversation, I have a friend, Peter Wax, who's writes in the fantasy genre, et cetera. And we would talk about stuff. He'd talk about some of the stories he was working on. He would describe these magic systems and like the magic system for like these things. And like, that always seemed like this really complex thing to me. Like, well, the way the magic works here, and I don't read like fantasy. And I remember I was at a convention and I had a book in front of me. It was mostly genre. And I have, Angel Killer. And she goes, what? I go, oh, it's a, a woman who comes from a family of magicians, who's in the FBI. And she goes, oh, what kind of magic does she use? I'm like, stage magic? She's like, no, her system, her magic system. And I'm like, and made me realize like, oh yeah, for this genre, like that's a thing. That's really a thing because that's the rules. Like I like to write science and put science and the rules of science in there. For many fantasy, readers, they like to read the world and magic with rules that are specific or makes it good. It's one of the things that Peter Jackson did to make the Lord of the Rings, movies great was he minimized magic, but made magic a physical sort of thing and tried to make the rules very, very clear for it. And so that would be an example. If you gave me like a fantasy book and it had a complex magic system, I'd be like, I don't know. I think it'd be great. I wouldn't know. So that's the challenge when you work with writing groups is that I think it'd be good to point out broad, obvious things you want to improve, but the downside is that it's a variable. There are going to be great groups and bad groups. It's hard to know what's going to be there. As far as for sources of encouragement, uh, I may be an outlier here, but the more you deprogram yourself from external sources of improvement, of encouragement, and you program yourself to want to have internal sources of it, the happier you're going to be as a person. And I know that's hard to say because we live in a world now that we've created this world around us where we wake up and see how many likes did our Instagram post, how many people retweeted our tweet, how many people, how much approval did we get electronically delivered to us. Where you want to be is just be a person who's centered and has a clear idea what you think is right and wrong, and observe and reflect and whatnot. And when it even comes to writing, is the end of the day is that you've got to decide, are you improving? And you're always improving. I'm improving. I'm trying to improve. Maybe I regressed. I don't know. You always want to be on that path. So critique groups and stuff, hard. Accountability groups. I mean, maybe again, other people may have had really positive experiences like that. And I don't want to like downplay anything like that. But I'm saying for myself is like the most important person to hold me accountable is me. And part of what you want to do there is actually, we may extend this because this is a big topic here, is you need to set, when it comes to goals, my goal as a writer, when I decided I was going to become a writer, I did not say to myself, I will be a New York Times bestseller. I did not say to myself, I will sell 1 million books. I did not say to myself, like, oh, I'm going to be, awarded a Pulitzer or whatever. I didn't set any of those kinds of goals because I think those goals are stupid. Why do I think they're stupid? Because you don't control them. You have no control over them whatsoever. And you're leaving other people to judge your success. And when you let other people, when you give them the remote control and you give them the ability to judge your success, you find yourself more and more dependent upon that. And it's harder to have ups until somebody tells you you're allowed to have one, and you're going to find a lot of downs. What did I set out for myself as a goal as a writer? To write. Okay. And then to write a lot. My first year, I said, I'm going to write 10 books. I'm going to write 10 books. Now, I was single at the time. I had an income coming in from an online business. So I had the time to do this, no kids, whatever. And so I spent that year writing a lot. I wrote over 1 million words in that year and trying to improve. And that was my goal, was get better. If I like a book, release a book and keep putting books out. Don't put every book out that I write, put every book I like out, but not get too attached to one book. And I said that was my goal, was to just keep producing and keep improving, not just put out a bunch of junk. Keep improving and try to get better at it, studying, like I mentioned before, going through the process of write a book, read a book on writing, analyze what I'm doing, take it forward, and then improve upon that. And I would say that I improved radically in a year. And I would say by 2 years after I had my first professional editor come in there, I went from never having written a book to writing a book that was a thriller finalist, so I would say that there was a lot of improvement there, not by accident. And I could not have done that had I not had that process to improve. But my finally, yes, I'm great. I got this acknowledgement. This was great. But that wasn't why I did it, and I got that because I set myself up as that. So, my point is like, understand why, if you go to a group and say, okay, I want to go to this writing group because I want to get notes on how to improve myself. I want people to point out things, but I'm not going to let it affect my self-esteem. I'm not going to come away from there, the meeting, feeling bad about me or whatever. Okay. If you say, I need some information about the world, about what I'm doing, that's great. And I'm a big believer in that. Having worked at a startup that was really into releasing things often and measuring the effect on that and watching the acceleration of that, I'm a big believer. The more information you get from reality about what you're doing, the better. And I understand it's got to be good information. Putting a book that you think is good out there and then reading the reviews to it is helpful. And you have to be careful not to like get to a point where you attach yourself so much to the work that it makes you feel bad about yourself. If I get a bad review about a book, it doesn't make me judge my value as a human being. it makes me think about, okay, what was this person's relationship with this work, this thing that I made? And I will make many things and produce many things. That's what you have to think about. You're going to produce many things. They're all not going to be perfect. Some will be great, some not so much, whatever. Some things will be. There's going to be a curve to that. And sometimes people are going to say things that are painful, and it's not really because it was accurate. Sometimes people are going to say things and they just don't get it. I've dealt with that. I've dealt with, sometimes I see stuff where some reviews feel like somebody had a bad day. Some reviews hurt because, like, yeah, all right. So point is, you need to detach yourself from that and you need to put yourself in a position where you can be more analytical. But anything gives you more information. So what gives you a lot of information? Having real readers read your stuff. Have your stuff, people read having beta reader groups. Like, I think that's a great thing. You've got a group of people that will read your stuff first. A lot of really accomplished writers, they do that. They have small groups of people they send themselves out to. I'm still imposter syndrome. Like, I get boxes full of like galley books that I can send out. I'm too embarrassed to send to my friends to read. How messed up is that? Because I'm just like, well, what if they don't like it? What if they have to tell me it's bad? Whatever. It's a horrible, horrible mental state to be in. So there you go. But ideally, and also it's, I can't do anything at that point. I can't, after the book is done, I can't do anything. But it's a good thing to give things to people early on. If I was not always running up against deadlines, I would give my books to a few trusted friends to say, what do you think, etc. So there is that. Tiffany wants to know, so glad to see you doing lives again. Are you going to continue to do them in the future? Yeah, I hope so. I hope to keep doing these. The challenge is just finding the right platform to do it on. It was so, we'll see what happens with like live streaming and stuff on Twitter, where that goes, if it becomes sort of a stable place to do it. I just loved Periscope back in the day. That was such an easy place because I live inside of Twitter and be able to do something there. So yes, I plan to do more of these. Anium says, hi, Andrew, you are my inspiration. I watched every episode of Don't Trust Andrew Mayne. Well, thank you very much. That would explain the $14 royalty check that I just got. I appreciate that. The Don't Trust Andrew Mayne was a show that I did 10 years ago on A&E, where I would play pranks on people using magic. And that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. And to have the opportunity to do that on TV was pretty cool. So back to goals for a second. And past the hour mark is fine. We'll keep talking for a little bit. Think about goals that you can be held accountable for. Okay. You can't be held accountable for a publisher deciding to pick up your book, because you can't control that. You can't control whatever goes on. I had an aspiration. I wanted to do children's television before I got into writing. Before I did my magic show, I wanted to do educational TV for kids. And I had a pitch and I wanted to go on a network and be able to do it. I wanted to do it on Discovery Kids. That was sort of my goal. Challenge was, by the time I got a pitch meeting with Discovery Kids, and I went to New York, flew to New York to go meet with an executive there with my producing partner, Mary. We flew to New York, and I knew this person like gnomes. I created magic. I had a magic trick where I pulled a gnome, like a garden gnome, out of my shoes, set it on her desk and all this. She took the meeting. She's polite, blah, blah, blah. So very nice, whatever. And then I found out like a week later, they were shutting down Discovery Kids. Flew to New York for no reason at all. That network was not going to exist anymore. And do I regret it? I don't know. I mean, hard to say, because it was one of those things where getting prepared for that, whatever. But that channel, if my goal was I will be on Discovery Kids one day, I'd be out of luck because it didn't exist anymore. What would I do with my goal then? If I said, oh, I will be on TV one day, well, even that's a hard goal because TV changes, and TV doesn't mean what it used to be. So what I do is I think about, like, when I wanted to try to get a TV show, I said my goal was, hey, every day I'm going to spend 2 hours researching, reaching out and figuring out what I need to do. And I'm going to shoot my own little mini pilot to put myself on tape. I'm going to do everything I did. Was all my goals were things I could control. If they didn't happen, it was because something me, not because the universe decided, not because some other person decided not. And people get in weird ideas like, oh no, if you really try, somebody will give us. Like, no, I don't believe in that. I don't believe in fate. I don't think it's predetermined. I don't think that there is some sort of karmic debt where the universe owes you or anything like that. I think things happen because you take action in the world. And the more you are self-reliant upon that, the better. And then eventually that can lead to things. So for me, if I want to be right now, if I was starting over and I said, hey, I just got an AI, I'm writing, never wrote books, what would I set for myself as a goal? One might be words per day. Another one might be, a timeline to say, I want to finish a novel in, let's say, 2 months. I want to finish a novel. And I'd break it down in a better way like that. Like, I'm going to have my outline done by here, do there. Words per day can be problematic because words per day can just lead you to, like, it's like a Soviet factory where you just put a bunch of words per day and congratulate yourself. But if they don't have any context or meaning, aren't connected to anything else, then it's not useful. But if you say, okay, I am going to have a 90,000 word novel in 3 months' time, and I'm going to get up every day. I'm going to write at least one chapter or whatever, revise my outline, do whatever that process. Then that's great. That's all under your control. Now, again, like, a hurricane can happen, life events can happen, but you're not waiting for the approval. The goal there isn't then I will get a publisher to publish it, because you can't control that. But you say, okay, I will then finish this novel, and then I think self-publishing is the better route, but it's just me. But if you're like, I will then find a publisher, well, you can say, I will then try to find a publisher. You can say what you're going to do. Like, oh, well, I will do letters of inquiry. I'll talk to people. I'll go to writing conventions. I'll talk to publishers. I'll do this. I will do X amount of work to get a thing. And that, to me, is a much more healthy way to do it, because you're not going to let anything externally make you feel bad. And when things aren't going your way, you have control. And that's the way you sort of move forward. So INM says, I started doing magic after I saw you. Now I'm performing at state level. Love you. You're absolutely amazing. Thank you very much. That is a wonderful thing to say. And that is a great point to close this here. This has been great talking to everybody. If you're catching this live stream later on and you have a question, just hit me up at Andrew Mayne on Twitter. Night Owl is the book. It's available right now. It's an Amazon Prime read. It'll be available later on for everybody else. Like I said, it's free for Amazon Prime members. If you like the book, what's the best thing you can do for a writer is tell other people why they might like it too. Okay. And that means you can leave a review, tell people what you enjoyed about it. Writing reviews can be hard. This is the easiest way to write a review for something. When I write a review, I think about, what did I like about a thing? And let me share it with somebody else. Because when I look and I read reviews, somebody might say, I really like this aspect of the story. I really like this, whatever. It doesn't have to be a general book report. Reviews on book reports to be a thing you like. And if you don't have a chance to read this, whatever, write a review for some other writer, for some other book you've read. Doesn't have to be a review for me. Write a review for something you like. Let's just pass that on, because that just moves books. Reviews move books on Amazon. The more reviews, and generally favorable reviews, the more momentum a book has. And so that is the secret of the universe of how things flow. So my homework for anybody who chooses it, it's not homework, whatever, is figure out the last book you read. Write a review for it if you liked it. Support that writer. Thank you for seeing everybody here. It's delightful to look into the comments here and to see people I haven't talked to in a while, including my buddy Funny Eddie. Eddie, I hope you're all well. Next time in LA, we should hang out. Tiffany, always fun to see you here. Everybody else, if I don't mention your name, I really, really appreciate you. And let's all do this again real soon.